Greetings and welcome to what I think is the 32nd episode of Morrowind Modding Interviews, though I'm not really sure. I've sort of lost track. But anyway, with me today is one of the lead developers from Tamriel Rebuilt, Gnomey. And first and foremost, thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
And if it's alright, we'll just start out with a few basic intro questions before we get into the meat of the Tamriel Rebuilt questions here. The first of which is, when did you first start playing Morrowind and the Elder Scrolls in general?
Yeah, my first Elder Scrolls game was Morrowind, and I started playing it actually pretty soon after it came out, though I don't remember exactly when, so 2002, 2003. The first copy that I had was actually secondhand and, for instance, lacked the construction set, and then later I got a, so let's say first-hand, and I got a directly bought version of the game.
Oh yeah, that's kind of surprising. You know, the construction set was a really big draw for Morrowind, around the start when it just came out, because that was, it was revolutionary kind of at the time.
Yeah, and definitely when I got the full version that had the construction set, I really leapt right into that. So.
Oh yeah, I think I spent dozens or hundreds of hours in the CS, like in 2003, just making these terrible, awful mods because I didn't have any idea what I was doing at all.
Yeah, it was the same, and often sort of huge areas of flat brown land filled with skeletons and I don't know what else, that sort of thing.
Now, just out of curiosity, have you made any mods outside of working on the Tamriel Rebuilt project?
I haven't really released any of my own, though I did contribute small things every now and then. I was part of the Fligerty community for a while and was also an admin on the forums there. And so I did provide feedback, but again, I didn't really see myself as a modder back then.
Oh, are you still active over on the Fligerty website?
Unfortunately not, no, I haven't been active there in a long while.
Oh yeah, it's had a few issues in the past year or two. I mean, you can still get to the forums, but you have to use the Morrowind history domain instead of the actual GHF domain.
Yeah, the forums lasted for quite a while and also moved and everything, and so yeah, it's not surprising that it hit some spotty patches.
Oh yes, I keep hoping that Fligerty will come back and just fix everything, but it has been going downhill for a little while now.
Yeah, well, I mean, with such an old game as Morrowind, it's of course hard to avoid that some of the fan websites go that route. But, well, we'll see.
Oh yes, that's a bit unfortunate, I think, because, I like the Nexus and everything, but I do like to have a few options outside of the Nexus.
Yeah, it definitely is nice to have alternatives, and Fligerty really is, and there's a lot going on there, and still is really, but again, it does seem to have its issues at the moment.
Oh yes, and what draws you to modding video games?
Well, I like creating things in general, and it's of course very nice with video games that you can create this world, this setting, and then you can be in it, and you can put castles or I don't know, whatever you want, and large landscapes, which obviously is a lot more expensive to do in reality, and quite a lot of trouble as well.
Oh yes, I think that's, a big, draw of modding is that you can just make your visions reality. Though I have noticed a lot of modders have been turning to actual game development these days with, like, the Unreal Engine and all that.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting, and I think modding is often also a gateway into sort of going more in depth with one's interests, and for example, going into game development and that sort of thing. Of course, there are a lot less limits theoretically if you have your own engine is the extreme case, or if you're working with an engine that doesn't have the limitations of Morrowind's. And so I think it can be very tempting for modders to have to go in that direction of game development, though it's of course a lot more work as well.
Oh yes, I have noticed this. We have lost a fair number of modders, I would say, to game development with the Unreal Engine, like in particular, in just the last couple of years. And it's like, no, don't get tempted, come back to mod Morrowind.
Well, of course, that's one of the cases where one can always be hopeful about Open Morrowind, which doesn't have a lot of those limitations, or, well, it's, the whole idea of it is Open Morrowind, so it's already in the name.
Oh yes, and moving on to some more specific Tamriel Rebuilt questions. How long have you been with Tamriel Rebuilt, and what got you started on the project?
So I joined Tamriel Rebuilt in 2005, and I mostly joined because I saw screenshots of it and was inspired by the creativity I saw in them, and so I wanted to take part in it. And yeah, exactly. And I've basically been with TR for most of the time since, though I did take some time off to finish school.
And just out of curiosity, what's your role at Tamriel Rebuilt? Is there a particular field of development that you're in?
So my role, or my title, I should say, is lead developer. And what that basically means in the end is, on the one hand, I am an admin, and on the other hand, I also basically have my fingers in a lot of pies really when it comes to working on the project. I do quite a bit with lore, and in general, not just Bethesda lore, but also Tamriel Rebuilt planning I'm quite familiar with, also old discussions and so on, because I've been around so long, and I've read a lot of threads. And so I'm sort of one of the resident lore experts, so to speak. But I also do a lot of work on, for example, the exteriors, both I have made exterior claims, but at the moment I mostly polish exteriors that have been created by others, and also interior work, and those are really my main focuses, though, as I say, I dabble in a lot of things.
Oh yes, I was about to say that your Tamriel Rebuilt forum profile lists you as both an exterior and an interior developer.
Yeah, exactly. I did start out with interiors and concept art, that's the other thing. But then I got into exteriors as well, and most of the work I've been doing lately has been more exterior work.
Now, is there a particular region that you've done a lot of interior work in, like the Telvannis lands, or maybe some of the more recent stuff?
My interiors are relatively few and far between. So there's, for example, a shipwreck in Lake Boethia, or however you like to pronounce that, which I made, and a few other things here and there, but it's not really too easy to spot. In the area that's going to be released soon, I did quite a lot of work in the exterior, and that you'll be able to see. But yeah, with interiors, they're, as I say, quite few and far between, so...
Oh yes, I think Haplo actually mentioned something similar, like his interiors were very few and far between.
Yeah, it's sort of the way of the project, and it's also usually nice as an interior developer to have a wide selection of things to work on. And so, for example, I made a Hlalu clothier and then a shipwreck off in Telvannis, and then also an Indrel tower I also made. And it's always nice to have such different things to work on, but it also means, of course, that the interiors that you create are then really spread out.
Oh yeah, and I imagine there's quite a few interiors up for grabs right now. I haven't actually checked on the forums. I used to look on there like from 2003 until I started the channel in 2014. But I imagine there's, a fair number of claims up right now.
At the moment specifically not, but that's mostly because we've been letting that slide a bit while working on the current release. And so we are planning to push some more claims out there in the pretty soon.
Ah, well, that's kind of surprising. I mean, considering how much of the exterior development has been finished for like Western Morrowind. I mean, I say finished, but obviously a lot of it's going to get overhauled. But I imagine there's, still room for interior development.
Yeah, we're putting a lot more thought into basically the planning behind the interiors and making them more interesting. Also more interesting descriptions, and having them be tied together a bit more. For example, currently we're working on the Thur River, which is the most important river in Morrowind, really, and is also a hotbed for political intrigue and all of those kind of things. And a lot of the interiors will tie into that. For example, a lot of smuggler caves that may be related to Hlalu, and a lot of small villages and so on that may be related to the Indrel. But because we're trying to be more coordinated about it, that of course means that just takes more time to set everything up than to sort of craft the world. And that's why we're being a bit more selective with releasing interior claims at the moment, or with opening them up.
Oh yes, I've read a bit about your lore of the sort of conflict along the Third River with Great House Salalu and the Endoral, and sort of what will happen in the future. And it does sound like it's going to be a rather, well, interesting region.
Yeah, and in general, we also sort of put a lot of thought into gameplay, and there will be all sorts of quests. It's a bit like in the vanilla case, you have the Calder Ebony Mine, and there were really quite a lot of quests that were related to it, from the House Redren, from the Fighters Guild even. And it'll basically be a similar idea to that, but on a somewhat larger scale, really.
Well, I can imagine, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. And, going on to this next question here, I'm sure everyone's kind of curious about this, but what's going on with the TR Spring Now Summer Update? Is the release likely to happen soon? I know there's been a news post about this recently on the website.
Yeah, basically, there it was a case where what it's basically waiting on is just some quests, also faction quest lines for Old Ebonheart, which just aren't quite done, but are really close. And we basically had the choice whether we were just going to make a cut and not include those quests, but it would have. But we felt that it was worthwhile to wait a bit to give a more full experience in Old Ebonheart. And the other thing is that we don't have that many people at the moment to test the quests, and we don't want to release a buggy mess either, and so that's why we decided to delay it after all.
So, is it just an issue of a lack of quest writers, or is it more like... I mean, you mentioned that there wasn't enough people to actually test the quest. Have you considered doing a limited public test, testing build or something, and just release it to the public to test specifically?
Yeah, it's certainly something worth considering, though I think that at this point, well, I mean, that's a problem that it's always seemed as though we were so close to being done, but not quite. And that's how it seems at the moment, so I'm not sure whether a public testing period would be necessary. But it's certainly something that might still be worth considering, especially if it keeps drawing on longer. But I mean, it is quite clear that the quests are very close to completion, and they are also very worthwhile quests, and there's a lot of really interesting writing and also scripting and so on going on in those quests. Yeah, I just wanted to add that also something that keeps standing out to me, which was also in that update post, was that we have about half as many quests in Old Ebonheart and the surrounding area as I believe we have in the rest of TR mainland. So that, as and again, really is with the quests in this update, and the quests are just huge. We really got a bit carried away with them, but that of course means that when the update does come out, that people will have a lot to play.
Oh, well, speaking of, what can we expect to find in the new TR release? I mean, there's been mention of adding some more lands to TR main, and of course the quests as you mentioned, but how much content are we talking about here?
Compared to the other TR releases, the area of land is relatively small, but still has quite a few things going on with it. So there's Old Ebonheart, which is one of the largest cities that will be in Morrowind, so sort of on the level with Port Ilvanis. And then there are two sort of decent-sized Veluthi villages and a bit more besides. And the region itself is a unique, so a new region type, but it's a relatively peaceful region. Though still, we've of course filled it with caves and everything else, but really the meat of the content will be in Old Ebonheart itself. And there it's mostly a focus on the Empire and Imperial factions, and so we have for the Imperial guilds, we have quests and a ton of miscellaneous quests as well, and also for the Imperial Legion and so on.
Now, you mentioned that Old Ebonheart is one of the largest cities, and I have to admit I haven't done a really good job of keeping track with the large cities on the Tamriel Rebuilt mainland. But how does it compare to, the other cities like Ban Malar? Is it like one of the second or third largest city in the Tamriel Rebuilt mainland? Or, I don't know. I know you guys have a tier system, but I can't remember what the tier rankings are.
Yeah, so at the moment, the tiers are a bit inexact, but as far as I know, with the TR mainland file, it will be, again, the second largest. I'm actually not exactly sure off the top of my head how large Portal Vanis is, so it's roughly like Portal Vanis. So either largest or second largest city in the release file. And in the end, it will be in the top 3 or 4 cities in Morrowind at all, so it really is one of the largest.
Now I can kind of see why it's been such a bottleneck for so long then.
Yeah, and like all of our large cities, it's definitely had a very long and troublesome development, though it hasn't been quite as bad as, well, of course, Amlexia is always the extreme case as far as difficult developments are concerned.
Oh, yes, I'm sure that'll come out in the next update too, right?
Well, might take a little longer than that, unfortunately.
Oh, yes, but sometime this year, surely, right?
Well, I think what a lot of people have been saying lately is 2090 as a safe estimate for TR as a whole being done, and so that would probably place Amlexia at around, I don't know, 2050 or so. It should be done by then.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it, and there's been a fair bit of talk both on the TR website and in these, past podcasts and interviews about integrating the mainland with the vanilla game instead of, keeping everything separate, which is what TR did for a really long time. Can you tell us, what potential new integrated content might be coming down the pipeline in the next few updates? I think there was a news post or two about this.
I think, as in the short term, the main things are really with the faction integration. Before TR had the division between the Vattenfell branch of a given faction and the mainland branch, and now we don't have that anymore, so they're just the same gameplay faction. That and the travel links, but those are both handled as external ESPs for the moment. In the long term, the integration will probably mainly take the form of some of the quest lines and such, so the house quest lines, for instance, might get integrated to some extent. But for the time being, we're mostly still focusing on compatibility, and so the TR Travels plugin and the TR Factions plugin are separate for the most part, as it isn't really integrated yet.
Oh yes, but wasn't there a news post recently about, the excuse me, Neverine, greeting thing?
Oh yeah, that's true. That greeting in particular was changed to have it only apply to poppers, and that is in general because it did get in the way of some of our dialogue, so it was really more of a fix. But I mean, it's also that particular line's always bothered me a bit, that's the only way I was greeted after finishing the main quest, so I was rather happy to see that happen as well. But it's more of an outlier just because it did mess with a lot of the stuff we were doing, and seemed as though it was really a bug on Bethesda's part as well, or not very well thought through.
Oh yes, I always hated that greeting. It's the reason why I only finished the main quest once in my entire life is because of that greeting. It's like I finished it, then everyone greeted me with that, and so it's like, well, this is annoying. So just go back, don't do the main quest, and just get your normal greetings back.
Yeah, it's always that greeting, and then the expansions also have their own versions. And so with Tribunal, there's Amlexia topic, where Dunmer, who wouldn't care about Amlexia at all, have the same dialogue as Temple people and so on, which is a bit weird. And then, of course, there's the Sulfsame as well, with, I've heard of that place, terrible and all of that. I find it a bit odd how Bethesda each time managed to add this annoying line of dialogue, but oh well.
Oh yeah, isn't there like a line in a Tribunal where you could tell someone that Almalexia is dead and then they would just stop talking to you, like period? It's like you couldn't greet them again?
Yeah, exactly, and I say that wasn't very well filtered either, and that's the issue with all 3 of those lines I mentioned, is that they're just not well filtered, that even people who shouldn't say that line do end up saying it.
Ah, well, that's Bethesda for you. And now I notice on the Tamriel Rebuilt website that you're currently writing a series on the, diverging lore of Tamriel Rebuilt and the inferior later Elder Scrolls games. So I'm kind of curious, what's all different with Tamriel Rebuilt's vision of the future of Tamriel after the end of the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind?
Well, as such, Tamriel Rebuilt doesn't really have a vision of what happens in the future, and I should say that those blog posts are my view of it, and the original idea is that one of the other leads of TR, Atrionis, he has rather different ideas from me, actually, of how the future will pan out, and he may also at some point make his own series of blog posts, a single blog post, or I don't know what, where he says what his version is. But for the most part, we do, of course, have to have a vague idea of what happens afterwards while writing our quest lines, where we want the story to develop within the faction quest lines and so on. But we like to leave things open, and that's, of course, the thing that came up in discussion just today, actually, that, for example, stuff like the future of Vivek, the god who is supposed to disappear, or with Nerva the Nervarin going over to Akavir, and all of that for us it isn't really necessary to say any of that because it's in the future, and so we just leave that to the player's imagination, or that if they kill Vivek early on, then Vivek's dead, and that's what his disappearance is, and if Vivek isn't killed, then the players can imagine whatever they like to happen. So the future posts, I say, are just my own view of how I see things developing afterwards.
So there could potentially be a sort of diverging lore in Tamriel Rebuilt itself, with your version and Atrionis' version and everyone else's version?
Yeah, definitely. Though again, I don't think it'll really come into the game because it's in the future. And that's also a thing that we might, for example, create nods to Oblivion or to Skyrim lore, but for the most part, that lore, or the events that happen in those games actively, or the political developments since Morrowind, are not really important for us, and we don't, and because they're in the future, we can't really represent them either.
Alright, and speaking of, I noticed in your lore series that you have some pretty interesting concepts regarding the Dres and the Hist. Care to go into some more details about that?
Yeah, so in the case of the Hist, they are actually still... There is another case where there's a bit of a difference in opinion about how exactly they should be handled, but they are a bit like Marsh as a whole. A lot of the appeal of the Hist does come from them being this vague, threatening thing that you can't really understand, or you don't really understand. And so, in general, the Hist will probably not play a direct role in the Dres quest line, but to the Dunmer, or as the Dres perceive them, they're this sort of vague threat, or this thing that constantly puts them on their guard. And the Dres themselves are... The way we ended up characterizing them is that they are actually a lot like the Ashlanders in Spear, and their background is nomadic, and the Dashan plains in which they mostly live are this really harsh landscape that is basically really salty, as in almost a desert, except that there are plants that manage to thrive despite the environment, despite the heat of the sun and the high saline content. And so the Dres are, again, in character a lot like the Ashlanders, but they banded together largely to benefit Dunmer society, and to that end their matriarchs, who are a bit like the Ashlander wise women, they made some pretty big deals, and that basically forged the Dres House as a sort of confederation of clans.
Oh yes, I had heard earlier that the Dres don't have, traditional cities as we think of them in the rest of Morrowind.
Yeah, exactly. They have clansteads, which are basically like the Dunmer strongholds, though they will be hexagonal in sort of in footprint. And as the name describes, as in the Dres are a confederation, and so they have a very strong clan identity, and so the clansteads have their own territory, so to speak, as well. So they may even end up having their own banners. That you have the Dres House banner, but the Dres themselves would more often use their own clan banner.
It sounds like there could be a lot of potential inter-house conflicts there.
Yeah, on the whole, the Dres actually surprisingly get along well with other houses, and part of that is because the other houses are dependent on the Dres, who plant the salt rice, which is the sort of most important crop in Morrowind and provides most of the food that the Dunmer eat and survive on. And so the Dres, in large part, even though their society is very backwards and they're very traditionalist, and while they do accept the tribunal, they haven't really embraced them the same way as the other houses. The other houses and Dunmer society in general are dependent on the Dres, and so sort of make sure to stay on their good side. But the Dres are certainly sort of they're extremely powerful, and the other houses are really somewhat nervous about them. And the main good thing for them is that the Dres are very isolationist. But if the Dres ever get bothered, then that can get really bad really fast.
Well, what I'm kind of curious about is because the Dres identify more as their separate clans. Is there a lot of, conflict within the Dres house itself?
Yeah, exactly. There are often sort of raids between the Chapthil, who are sort of really, in many ways, it's sort of odd to say, but I equate the Dres a lot with cowboys in their attitude, and so they have this again traditional herding culture, and so they have these Chapthil who are a bit like cattle ranchers, and they have their other retainers who are a bit like cowboys, and they often fight with neighboring clans as sort of border skirmishes, and so they don't really get along very well, but mostly they're stable. It's just sort of border friction.
Okay, I have to admit, Dunmeri Cowboys is not a thing I thought I wanted before, but I definitely want that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how well we can explore it, because the design for the Deshan Plains are also relatively flat, and part of the reason for that is that we're hoping to be able to implement really large insects as well in those plains, which is always very difficult with Morrowind because the creatures always stay exactly horizontal. So, if they're on a slope, then half of them will be inside the slope and the other half will be floating in the air. But hopefully with the relatively flat landscape, we'll be able to also have really large herded insects included rather convincingly.
Oh yes, that reminds me of something from a while ago. What was it? There was that sort of hive-like model design that the Resdane Revival series was working on.
Yeah, exactly. The hive probably won't be used in Deshan itself, but the Deshan does have skyrenderers who are basically like giant wasps that the Dres ride to an extent. And there's also a bit of interesting lore there. It hasn't been too much explored, but basically I had this idea that rather than saying that the Dres teamed the Skyrenderers were sort of the rulers in a way. They were dominant in the Deshan Plains when the Dres came, and the Skyrenderers almost ended up sort of teaming or adopting the Dres to them, and so they have a sort of symbiotic relationship going.
Interesting. And I was also kind of curious, how does Tamriel Rebuilt plan to do the city of Tyr, which is supposed to be in, the Dres territory? If the Dres don't have traditional cities, is it more like a market meeting place?
Yeah, basically, Tyr is actually. I sort of like the direction you went there because the Dres don't really like Tyr or have a high opinion of it. The thing is that before the Dres rely heavily on trading with others, but they are still extremely xenophobic and isolationist, and so they really didn't like it when outsiders came over into their territory to trade with them. And so Tyr was mainly established as a sort of trading post with which they could do trade with mostly non-Dunmer, but also with, for instance, Slavani. And it will still be a large city, and it will also be an extremely diverse city, as in it will have Slode, for instance, traders will be in Tyr and so on. We already have those creatures, thankfully. And so it will really be a very interesting place, but it's a very atypical as a house capital because the Dres consider their own clansteads to be their sort of capital and don't and they see Tyr as a necessity but don't really like the place. They avoid it if they can.
Hey, so that is a very interesting direction to go in, and we haven't really seen a whole lot of Slode in, well, really the Elder Scrolls series too much.
Yeah, and that is also a bit of a challenge because we have so few representations, and the most familiar and the most well explored one was in the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard Nagasta. And the thing is that he wasn't really a very typical Slode. He was a necromancer who made a deal with Clavicus Vile, but that seemed to just be the sort of what he as an individual did. But that easily ends up coloring people's perception of the Slode in general. So we'll also have to do quite a bit of work there with how exactly we want to portray the Slode. But it's also certainly interesting, and the Slode may play a larger role in the Dres questline than the history was, and that we may end up actually exploring them a bit more.
So, from what I'm understanding, like, the permanent population of Tyr is, would you say it's mostly foreign? Does it have a large imperial influence?
The exact makeup of the population, I'm not actually clear on. It probably will still have mostly Dunmer, but often relatively low status Dunmer or Dunmer who are sent by their clan to basically, make deals and so on. And otherwise, it will really just be, there will be Imperials there. It's also quite likely that in Dresslands, that's the only place where you'll find Imperial guilds. But the Imperials won't have a majority or anything either. It will really be a mixture, and we also will probably want to put in as many creatures from outside of Tamriel, like the Slode themselves, as we end up having in the shared Tamriel data. So there are also the Marmor, or however you want to call them, the Tropical Mirror. They may end up having some sort of appearance in here as merchants. And if we ever end up with, for example, with Akaviri races, there's a possibility we'll have those in here as well. It's really supposed to be extremely cosmopolitan in a way, as this huge marketplace.
Well, I have to admit, that all sounds, well, really kind of exciting. It's not really like anything else that we've experienced in Morrowind.
Yeah, there are really a lot of opportunities with that area in general, also with the characterization of the Argonians as well, that there's really so much interesting lore to explore and so much we can do with it. So it definitely has a lot of us very excited to get into that region.
Oh yes, I imagine there's quite a bit of a creative freedom there.
Yeah, there definitely are a lot of gaps, and also things like the Hist, while they are every now and then described in lore, it's often very contradictory what you find, and also with out of lore sources. And so it gives us sort of a lot of interesting ideas to work with, but also a lot of room to use our creativity and come up with very interesting stories and such.
Now, speaking of the Hist again, just to bring it up, I mean, it sounds like from your lore series on the website that the Dres had some sort of, devil's deal with the Hist, like they were providing Dunmeri souls to them. What's up with that?
Yeah, that's exactly the thing, that there were basically three big deals that the Dres matriarchs made at the sort of very start of basically when the tribunal came to power around then. And one of them was with the Hist. And it was basically they realized that to provide for this new sort of nation that the tribunal had established, that they would need to have a lot of basically food to support the population. And so their deal with the Slode was basically to find out how they could plant salt rice on a large scale. But to do that, they still needed a lot of slaves, and the Dres were not themselves a very powerful house at the time. And so then that's where they ended up making the deal with the Hist for basically a large number of Argonian slaves to work their plantations. And in return, they would give a small number of Dunmer, which to them was, as into the Dres, was a really high cost because they take the Dunmer very seriously. That for them it wasn't really an easy choice, but they ended up doing that. And exactly, and that is basically the thing. They have this deal going with the Hist, but it requires them to constantly send over their own as basically sacrifices to the Hist, and they don't know what happens to them, and they suspect the Hist are doing all sorts of crazy things with them.
Well, that is, well, certainly kind of creepy, really, and it's a lot different than what I was thinking of before. Like, in Vanilla Morrowind, I always just assumed that the Dunmeri just, sent in slave hunters down into Black Marsh and just kidnapped people or something.
Yeah, they do a bit of that as well, and it's also, the deal is very secret, and so neither the Argonians nor the Dunmeri know about it. And that was also sort of interesting bit of lore development that we made, is that the Arnesian War, which started when a Dunmer was martyred, supposedly, I think it was supposed to be a caravan or something, was killed by Argonians. We sort of created this lore that he was actually one of the Dunmer who had been sent over to the Hist, who tried to escape. And then the war basically happened as the Dres were trying to basically put a lid on the whole thing, and it became this huge mess. And that was about 30 years before the game, and so it still has will have an impact on the then development of the Dres questline.
Now that's really rather interesting. And speaking of wars, I noticed that another part of your lore series mentions a planned revolt amongst the Nords of northwestern Morrowind by High King Theon. Is there some cross coordination going on there with the Skyrim Home of the Nords team?
Yes, there is. Though for the most part, it's a local rebellion of the Nords who basically stuck around in Morrowind, and so these very small isolated communities. And so the involvement of Skyrim and of High King Theon is very is occurring behind the curtain, and you probably will find out about it in the Redern questline, but it won't be very apparent that he's behind it.
And the lore series you're doing also kind of makes it seem like there's a bit more of border disputes going on with Skyrim, and raiding parties being sent out from Skyrim along the Morrowind coastline.
Well, that mostly starts actually after the after Tiara's timeline. That first there's this local uprising, and then after that King Theon starts sending the raiding parties, and that is actually also Bethesda lore. I think it's mentioned in Oblivion Rumors, and that sort of will end up weakening the Redern before the Daedric invasion.
Oh yes, I think I remember hearing some of that in Oblivion, though. Oh well, I can't really remember a whole lot of details from that because that game was so forgettable.
Yeah, but I mean that is again one of the sort of differences, that with that lore series, it's my own version of what happens in the future, and for me, a lot of the ideas that come up in Oblivion and later in Skyrim, especially with the Dragonborn expansion, I don't really like how they were described, but I think it's sort of interesting to work those ideas in and think about how it could plausibly have happened. And one of the examples of that is also what's mentioned is an alliance between House Dres and House Lalu through King Helza. I think a marriage alliance or something, and that apparently came from an RP that the Bethesda developers were involved with. And there also comes this bit of lore about about Helzath outlawing slavery, and a lot of people aren't very keen on that. But I think it's sort of interesting as a thought experiment to think how could things have happened so that those specific events do occur, but in a way that fits in with the setting as shown in Morrowind, that the Dres, for example, would be so clearly against outlawing slavery. So what would have had to go wrong for something like an outlaw of slavery to have ended up happening? And I think that's a sort of very interesting concept to work with, and so that's what I do in the lore series.
Oh yes, and you also mentioned a lot of, sort of house conflicts that are going on after the Tribunal Temple sort of kind of falls apart. And I mean, are we going to see some of that happening in the Tamriel Rebuilt questlines?
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially with the Indril and Hlala houses, that will play a really major part in the faction storylines. And that's also, and really a central part of those conflicts will be basically with the control of the Thea, or Third River, that the Indril currently control the East Bank, and the Hlalu took control of the West Bank from the Indril before, and the Hlalu now want to expand over to the East, and so there's this really large conflict brewing over there, or really already underway.
Oh yes, and of course the player will be able to take part on either side, I imagine.
Yeah, and there will also probably be quite a lot of missed quest lines as well, where the player can sort of do smaller things that contribute to the sort of conflict, or that have some sort of impact on its development. And the conflict also has drawn in the Imperial Legion and the Temple, which are trying to remain neutral, but the Temple has very strong ties to Indril, and the Empire, of course, has very strong ties to Hlalu, and so then the houses are sort of trying to drag those factions onto their side as well. And even House Redern actually has a presence on the river and may end up being pulled into it to some extent, and the Dres as well. So it's really this huge central conflict in Morrowind.
Now, I'm kind of curious, are there going to be a lot of, world changes that occur with these events? Like, will you actually, see the result of these conflicts in the actual world space? I mean, that's not really something that Morrowind did a whole lot, but, is Tamriel Rebuilt planning to, show how the Hlalu are, progressing onto the eastern banks, or how the Indor are just holding back the Hlalu?
Yeah, we will have a bit of that, though the exact extent isn't quite clear, and we probably won't have anything huge. It's not like in the end we'll, replace all of the Indril towns with Hlalu, with a Hlalu occupation or anything. It won't be on that scale, but there will definitely be world changes. And what is also quite interesting is that the Hlalu player's stronghold on the mainland will actually itself play a pretty central role in that conflict, and it will sort of, as the player strongholds do, it will grow during the quest line, and actually really has a very sort of focal role in how the conflict unfolds.
Oh yes, that's another thing really, since you mentioned it. I know Tamriel Rebuilt's been planning to do, player strongholds on the mainland for a long time, but I'm kind of curious, how big are these strongholds going to be? Are they going to be vanilla-sized, or are they going to be more, town-sized?
Yeah, there's a sort of specific idea that I ended up... I actually also have a blog post on this, though I didn't put it onto the main page, but I think anyone's able to read it. But basically I had this particular concept for how to handle the player strongholds, because 3 of them, of course, and for 3 of the houses already exist in Vattenfall. And my basic idea is, which I think I managed to sort of convince people on as a sort of interesting idea, is that that players will actually get 2 strongholds of some description, and together those 2 strongholds will be balanced between factions. And so usually it will be 1 large stronghold and 1 small stronghold. For instance, the Hlaalu mainland stronghold will be the large one, and then the Faith and Manor on Vattenfall will then be the smaller one, or that's the idea at least. And the faction quest lines, the house faction quest lines in TR, will be quite a lot larger than the vanilla ones. And so, again, it's not clear how large the strongholds will become, but I definitely want them to become quite large. And for example, the Hlaalu mainland stronghold, I do want to have be a decent town, a bit like Suran in the end, a bit on that scale. But again, there's a bit of discussion there about exactly how large we want them to be. But basically the strongholds will probably develop over a longer period than they did in the Vattenfall quest line, which was shorter.
And on a similar vein, I'm kind of curious, are you guys planning to do the whole, all the strongholds get built at the same time, regardless of which house you join? Or are you just going to have, one of them develop?
That hasn't really been discussed, but I think probably it's possible that we'll either basically do that like with the vanilla approach where they all get built at the same time, or it's also possible that we'll be a bit more selective with it and have some be built and some others not. But but at the moment, what I would personally lean towards is keeping the vanilla approach, because it's because for me, I always like having sort of developments in the world that happen beyond the player, and the other strongholds being built up are always a direct opportunity for that, to have other developments happen. For example, the Redren mainland stronghold, it isn't quite clear what it will be yet, but it will probably have some relation to the Nord Uprising. And so that means that the Nord Uprising might still be a thing, though on a much smaller scale, not explored as thoroughly, even if the player is basically doing another faction quest line, that it will still happen to some extent.
So these strongholds might not grow to the importance of like the faction the player is actually a member of.
Yeah, but that specific aspect hasn't really been discussed, so I'm not really sure how that will end up happening.
Oh yes, I imagine that's pretty far down the line. I mean, Northwest Morrowind is... I don't even think it's up for interiors yet, or even finalized exteriors.
Yeah, the exteriors will probably get a bit of work, though for the most part the work there is very solid, certainly from a technical standpoint. And as far as interiors are concerned, there's a bit of preliminary planning, but one part of it is that we're sort of hesitant to open up interiors in northwestern Morrowind because it gets quite cold and snowy, and it may be that we'll end up having some sort of Dunmer cold weather assets like warm clothing and so on. And we'd really want to have those before we start making a lot of interiors notes, so that we don't need to go in and add them after the fact.
So that's kind of just waiting on asset creation then?
Yeah, though it is also because we already have a lot to do in the area we're working on, which is sort of central Morrowind, and we're doing a lot with House Hlaalu at the moment, and it's quite likely it'll also stay that way, though again there's quite a lot of variability, and part of that is, for instance, what assets are available to us, and another part is just what people are interested in, because it is a volunteer project, and clearly if there's absolutely nobody who wants to who likes House Dres or wants to do anything with it, then obviously it will be very hard to get progress in that area. Thankfully, we don't have anything extreme like that, so it's quite open, but as a result, it really is assets and, as I said, also planning and coordination that are the main roadblocks to working on a certain area.
Well, I imagine the vanilla Raydoran quest line probably didn't do any favors for anyone.
Yeah, I also think that's also sort of interesting aspect of how the vanilla quest lines will be implemented. As I mentioned, that will eventually be a part of the or it's quite possible that'll be one of the changes that TR does end up making to vanilla content, is how the faction questlines will play out. But the Red Ring questline in particular will probably not be touched much, because it is such a it's clearly so limited to Vvardenfell and to the leadership there. And the basic scenario that TR set up is that all of the Red Ring leadership moved over to Vvardenfell and basically have their own stewards and so on taking care of their mainland holdings. And so that's basically what you'll be dealing with in the Vvardenfell quest line, are the stewards and so on, not necessarily the actual leaders of House Dres so much.
Ah, interesting. And, well, just out of curiosity, is there any particular region that you're really excited to see get finished and released to the public? Well, we joked about this earlier, like the long-lost city of Almalexia.
I mean, at the moment, sort of conceptually, there's such good ideas floating around for all of them. I definitely think, as in with the Dresslands and so on, because it's such a different direction, such a different take, and again, because you have so many interesting groups there, it's definitely sort of top of the list. But another thing is that I used to actually not be much of a fan of House Lalu, but I really like how the house has been heading in terms of sort of planning in TR, and so I'm actually also now quite looking forward to Lalulands as well. And I mean, just to sort of show how many places I'm interested in, also with the Thur conflict around the Central River with the Indral content, for me that's also really interesting. So I really have no shortage of places that I want to see finished, but it'll also just be very fun, of course, to develop them as well. And there, it's the main thing is with assets that with a lot of the regions we plan to work on, that's really just more asset development, and also concept art would really help a lot in moving those forward, because definitely in terms of ideas and in terms of enthusiasm, that is all there.
Well, as far as unfinished regions are concerned, Narcissus is always one of the cities I've wanted to see, Tamriel Rebuilt's take on, because it's supposed to be a really big, lofty city with, towers and everything, and that'll, it'll be pretty exciting to see what Tamriel Rebuilt does with that.
Yeah, as in with Narcissus, in general, I'd say that Old Ebonheart and Narcissus sort of probably compete for the second largest city in Morrowind. And Narcissus will definitely also be very interesting. And again, like most of those really large cities, it will really be a thing unto itself. In the case of Narcissus, the very basic concept we have for it at the moment is just sort of layers and layers of intrigue and plotting at sort of all levels, with the Lalu leadership, but also with whatever guilds and tongues, which are basically Dunmer guilds and so on, being there, that it's just this sort of constant web of intrigue and so on, and there's really a lot going on below the surface of Narcissus. So yeah, I also think that there's quite a lot of potential for developing it in a very interesting direction.
Oh yes, I mean, it is the Halalu. They're basically all intriguing, backstabbers, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, another thing in the case of Narcissus is that most, if not all of the interiors have actually been made, though that was a long time ago, so they may need a bit of fine-tuning and so on. But really, with Narcissus, well, it probably won't be released for a long time, because we'll want to complete the land towards Narcissus, and it's basically currently sort of in an island by itself. A lot of it actually has already been implemented, and so well, one can always hope that it won't have quite the troubled development that some of the other large cities will have and have had.
No, really, I didn't realize that it was so far along in terms of interiors. I mean, is the exterior development, partially finished?
Yeah, the exterior of Narcissus itself exists, and in the TR preview file you will also be able to visit it, though it's not really in a very presentable state at the moment, because well, it wasn't really to begin with, as in that it was a bit unpolished to start with, but also with the changes to the surrounding height map and so on, that ended up affecting Narcissus. And for example, the ground textures are, I think, are all gone, and so it's sort of all this brown ground, and so it doesn't really look very great or very polished at the moment. But the basic work is all there, and it shouldn't really be hard to polish it up when we get to it.
No, I must have just never noticed it down there. I always just assumed that area was just completely unfinished. I never, jumped down there in the TR preview.
Yeah, no, I mean, really the surrounding area as in around Narcissus, you have this really weird thing, which is that there are Hlaalu towers there. I don't think they've been removed. There are Hlaalu towers there that have drummer ceiling fans, which are to represent windmills. Of course, that implementation won't stay. It's sort of just this weird placeholder. But otherwise, that land is pretty much completely empty, and Narcissus' own little bubble of completed land. But yeah, as I say, it's I'm not surprised that a lot of people miss it, just because it is so isolated from other worked on content.
Oh yes, and you mentioned it's an island, so is it going to have, some suburbs that are, actually on the mainland?
Narcissus itself isn't actually quite an island as far as I'm aware. It's sort of a peninsula, so there's this bend in the river. It's actually the source of the Third River, that it bends around Narcissus, and so basically is around three sides of it. But the left side is connected to land, and the basic territory is called Shipel Shin, and it will be a sort of red canyon landscape. But Narcissus will exist in a sort of fertile valley between the canyons.
So sort of like the Rothrorian sort of region?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's similar to that region style. Yeah, though again, it will be red, and so as in a different palette, and also the rocks will look a bit different, but in general, it'll be in the same vein as Rothrorian. Yeah.
Speaking of the Rothrorian, what's going on with that region? I understand it's going through some sort of graphical overhaul?
Yeah, that was actually relatively unplanned, but the thing is that with TR, there's this odd history of rocks, while it's weird to say it that way. But basically, TR has always been rather ambitious with its landscapes and has wanted to have stuff like cliffs and mountains and so on. But the assets for that weren't always available, and so at different times the developers did things in different ways, and often the way that things were done is that just vanilla rock assets were piled up into these sort of ugly masses, and that was sort of used to fill landscapes and to make them mountainous. And that didn't really look very good, and so there were already some ideas of basically improving the situation there. And then one of the old heads of exteriors back when we had those of TR, so someone who had a lot of experience working on exteriors and had also made the current iteration of Amlexia, came along and wanted to overhaul it. And so we basically said, yes, please, go ahead. And it's really been a huge transformation, so more than expected, but in a good way, as in it's really a very interesting region now, and it's not quite finished, but already, as in it'll be in the TR preview file, and will be very worth visiting already.
Oh yes, I noticed that Nimin is sort of back and very active now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he has been doing a few. Aside from the work in Rothrorian, he's also been working on some Hlaalu land a bit further south than the third region, which we're currently working on. And so, yeah, that's been a very welcome sight, certainly.
Oh, you're not going to torture him by forcing him to redo Almalexia again?
I think actually he wants to eventually be the one to implement the changes to Amlexia when they are done. But, of course, again, don't expect that anytime soon.
Alright, you heard it here, folks. Almalexia, release 2020. Expect it then.
Well, I mean, considering how well we've kept the deadline this time,
Oh yes, and speaking of the summer update, outside of this next major update, what is the next step for Tamriel Rebuilt? What part of the mainland will be the next big priority later this year and going into 2019?
Yeah, I mean, we do actually have quite a lot of backlog on more technical stuff to do that we'll probably want to tackle after this release. And so it is possible that that for the next actual landscape release that it will be a bit longer again. But we will probably first and foremost, as in when we basically get done with it, release the rest of the region, the Antherin it's called, the region around the Thea that we're working on, because that's actually really quite close to completion as well. But it has two roadblocks in the form of one is a Canton stronghold, basically, of the temple, which spans the Third River, and then the other is an Indral, sort of a palace stronghold that they have, which is Roadir. It used to be a city, and it's undergoing quite large transformation at the moment, with our relatively new take on House Indral. And so those have proved to be roadblocks, but otherwise that surrounding region has already seen a lot of work and is very far along, and so that will almost certainly be the next landmass release then.
Oh yes, those two palaces or strongholds are, one of the really scenic parts of that region there, though I will say that the FPS in, Rodai or Dar, is just really atrocious.
Yeah, I'll have to see how that develops, but unfortunately it's the region as a whole was made quite forested, which is already, usually very taxing on PCs, and then it has these locations like Old Ebonheart and Roadir, I call it, but however people pronounce it. And yeah, we'll have to see what we can do there, but I mean, with a lot of things, we're really, again, I'll probably mention it a few times, but very hopeful of Open Morrowind, which on the whole is supposed to have better performance, that eventually it will alleviate some of the issues, because we do try and optimize, but with the very sort of complex level of detail that has become the standard of TR and that we work with, there's only so much we can do to really keep the performance down. I mean, without, for example, removing all of the NPCs from the exterior cell and having it be a ghost town or something, which we obviously don't really find acceptable. So performance will probably be an issue, but we are trying to see what we can in terms of optimization.
Oh yeah, and a lot of that is just on the game engine itself, because it does not handle detailed environments particularly well.
Yeah, no, that's definitely an issue, and again, there does seem as though Open Morrowind is really doing a lot better, and so we'll have to see how it goes. But but performance in those areas probably won't be so good, and also, of course, the most extreme cases with Amlexia there as well. I don't know what real man should do to try and keep the performance halfway reasonable, especially working with the vanilla Morrowind engine, but we'll just have to see what we can do.
Well, I mean, the current version of Almalexia is pretty good on performance, though of course it doesn't have any NPCs, but, that's just a minor detail.
Yeah, that's the issue, though. I mean, for me, what I always think of is that we have the sort of, I suppose you could say, sister project that's working on Cyrodiil. They'll eventually have to make the Imperial City, and so, I think that for however difficult it may be for us with Amlexia right now with Roadir, that really I'm just happy that we don't have to deal with that challenge, which is another step up by itself.
Oh yes, or the city of Anvil, which is looking pretty large by itself.
Yeah, definitely some large cities out west, which is also quite reasonable, really. But definitely Amlexia will be one of the, as in also on the provincial, on the continental scale, will really be a major city in that term as well. But I'm pretty sure it's larger than Anvil, though I don't have the exact numbers in my head. No, it'll certainly be But yeah, quite a lot of large cities for people to visit eventually.
Oh yeah, I just mean like the early version of Anvil, the one that Predator was working on was, pretty massive. That Predator does tend to just make large cities all the time.
Oh yeah, I think that all of the mod projects have had that, isn't it? Also with Skyrim Home of the Nords, that I know that they scaled down their cities, and Narcissus, for instance, there was a far larger version of Narcissus which had all sorts of crazy things, sort of golden statues everywhere of things like Nyx hounds and slaughterfish and Noah. And so, for example, the current implementation of Narcissus, which is still a huge city, but has been toned down a lot from how it used to be.
Oh yes, I think I remember those old screenshots of Narcissus. I think they were on the old Tamriel Rebuilt website.
Yeah, they are actually still. I mean, you have to dig for them, and at the moment, the search function is unfortunately broken on the old website. But the screenshots do still exist if you find them, and they are quite a sight to see. That, yeah, certainly the modders back then were very ambitious and occasionally got a bit carried away, but I mean, still impressive in its own right.
Oh yes, well, you know what they say, feature creep is the bane of all modding.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, again, that's even the case with the current release, with just how many quests we ended up adding to Old Ebonheart, that is also really feature creep that we could have stopped a while earlier and it would have still been a huge amount of content. So it is a constant struggle.
Oh yes, but that's quests. That's different. You can't have too many quests. It's impossible. More quests, the better, I always say.
Yeah, though I do know that, of course, what's difficult then is with the testing and reviewing the quests that it's very easy to get carried away with implementing things like quests and dialogue and just have these huge quest lines, or have this really complex dialogue. But of course, with TR, we do try and actually go through and test that stuff. And yeah, as it turns out, that takes a lot of time and a lot of people willing to do it.
Oh yes, I can imagine. I mean, I've done a few multi-choice like ending quest lines before, and it's like, they're very small mods, but they still take 20 to 30 development hours of testing to get perfect.
Yeah, and again, quite aside from just the amount of quests in Old Ebonheart, some of them are also really ambitious, and so you do have things like branching paths and so on. So it's definitely no easy undertaking.
Oh no, definitely not. And sort of going on here, we've talked a lot about the Dres lands, but what is going on with the Dres these days? Has much progress actually been made with them, or are they still mostly just in the planning and concept art phase?
Yeah, there has been some work on their assets. The only problem is that we have actually quite a bit of flora for the Deshan Plains, so we're pretty good on that count. But otherwise, it's just very spotty, the amount of content that we have. That modelers started working on some assets, but still haven't quite finished them and so on. And so that's really the main bottleneck at the moment, is with Dresslands. And I always sort of try and add that aside from just asset developers, what would really be good is to see more concept artists, because we're especially lacking in functional concept art at the moment. So, for example, in the Dresslands, there will be quite a few tile sets that we have the Dress clansteads and the Dress camps, for which we already have some concept art, but even that concept art could use a bit more detailing and stuff like awnings and all of those things, but also in the Dresslands, there will be, for example, the salt washes, which are sort of partly organic and perhaps partly artificially expanded series of canals below the Dresslands, which supply the plantations with water, with basically relatively fresh, relatively low salt water. And that tile set will also need to be created, and rocks and so on and so forth. So there's really quite a lot of asset development work to be done there, and it would also be really good to see more concept art for asset developers to work off of, because often the art is relatively lacking, or even when it's there, that it could be improved or could be expanded.
Well, you could always just use the Dres tile set from 2005. I mean, that's aged wonderfully. And it'll just look beautiful. Just throw those big, tall, brownish-like buildings in there.
Yeah, I don't actually even know. We probably have those files somewhere, but I think locating the files would be a task on its own, and then polishing them up, of course, or making them usable. That would be quite the undertaking. But on the whole, I mean, we do have some nice designs and already have some very nice assets created, but it looks as though it will unfortunately still be a while until we have enough to actually open up exterior claims.
So I guess this kind of brings me to my next question here, which is a user-submitted question from Null Cascade. What is Tamriel Rebuilt currently needing the most of? What can the general community do better to, get people contributing to Tamriel Rebuilt?
Well, I'd actually say, while I've been talking about assets and concept art, and that's really very important, and we could really use help there. But at the moment, really the number one thing that we could use the most are reviewers for quests, for interiors, and also for exteriors, though to a large degree interior and exterior reviewers, they can sort of do the same task. But that's a real bottleneck, and the problem is that reviewers need to first go through a showcase process for quests or interiors or exteriors to become Tamriel Rebuilt developers, and then they need to complete the reviewer test for them to become reviewers. But we really need those, and they're very important to make sure that we can basically have the content up to our standards so that we can then merge it into the game. And so reviewers is definitely top of the list. And then after that, as say, I especially, but in general, we could really use more concept art. I'm a bit biased in that sense, as who doesn't like to see some very nice concept art, actually? So I guess I'm not so biased. But yeah, concept art and asset developers, there have actually been quite a few who have been working with us, but really, as in the end, I suppose we did get quite ambitious, and so we really need more there. And I also want to sort of add, I think it's been said quite a lot before, but that really can't be said often enough, that the showcase process is only necessary for people who want to implement things in the CS. But for example, it's not like modelers and concept artists. They don't actually have to do the showcase process. They can just start contributing right away. And we also have an asset browser in which people can basically submit their assets and all of that so that we can then look at it. So those are definitely top of the list. And even without becoming a reviewer, again, testers, for example, there's nothing stopping people from sort of coming over to our Discord and so on and saying that they want help testing with quests. And that's also extremely welcome, of course. At the moment, with interiors and exteriors, we're trying to get claims moving there again, but again, at the moment, we don't have such a large selection, and so really the other areas are where we have the most bottlenecks at the moment in terms of where we really need more people to help along.
Oh yes, I can imagine that getting more reviewers would be a bit difficult. I mean, you'd basically be, you'd go through the showcasing process, sign up to do the thing that you probably want to do, like making interiors or exteriors, and then reviewing someone else's work instead of, just making your own stuff. I can see how that might be, not quite as enjoyable. Plus, the reviewers, I've seen the review reports on like Tamriel Rebuilt, and they're quite thorough. Like for an interior cell, it's like going through and checking, make sure that each item is properly on the correct surface. Like, like with the DP furniture for showcases and all that.
Yeah, but for that, I think the reviewers definitely get the appreciation because again, especially because we have had shortages of reviewers lately, it's really clear how important they are to the project. So again, if you want to get a lot of appreciation, that's definitely the way to go, is that reviewers are very useful.
Now, going into our more typical recruitment questions, if someone wants to join up with Tamriel Rebuilt, what's the very first thing that they should do?
Well, I mean, the first thing is just to come around. It's usually easiest to come to Discord, but you can also just make a sign up to the forums and make a sort of thread there or a showcase directly. Though again, you only need to really make showcases if you, as I said before, if you want to basically make interiors or exteriors, or if you want to implement quests in the CS. But with writing and so on, you can really just and start contributing. There really isn't any threshold, and if you're not quite sure what to do, we're always happy to ask questions. And there's also no prerequisite skill. That we don't expect people who open up an interior showcase to churn out a perfect interior. If that were to happen, we wouldn't need the showcase process. It really is a process that helps you improve, and I can also say that for myself, with my concept art and with my interior work and modding in general, that just contributing to TR has really improved my skills a lot. And so, again, there are no real prerequisites coming in. Anyone is able to help. Again, even things like just testing or, for example, proofreading literature or whatever, all of that is helpful. So there's no barrier to entry, and there are a lot of ways that you can help. And again, we're always happy to answer questions if you're unsure, what best to help with.
Oh yes, and sort of on a similar sort of questions here with regards to the showcases, are there any particular recommendations that you can give to new modders with regards to, making their first showcase, whether it's for interiors, exteriors, or quests? Like things that typically, get overlooked by first-timers?
Yeah, we do actually have a TR modder handbook, which does have guides and guidelines to making the showcases, and so definitely read those. But otherwise, those should really just give you all of the knowledge that you actually need to go into it, doesn't that? And otherwise, I'll say if you have any other questions, that you can just ask them. But really, I mean, again, it is good to read those, at least, that you're able to make a decent submission. But we don't expect the first submission to be to pass a showcase. We do expect that there will be a lot of development going on, and so for the most part, you don't really need to worry about it beforehand. You can just come in, make a showcase, and start working on it, and then we'll basically sort of take it from there.
Oh yes, and I don't think very many people actually, pass with their very first, showcase submission. I mean, I've been browsing TR for like over a decade, and usually most people have to go through like 2 or 3 versions.
Yeah, it's extremely rare for people to pass in the first version, and I mean, to an extent, that isn't really the idea behind it as well, because part of what you want to be able to be sure of is that people are able to sort of take the criticism of reviewers and improve their claims and fix issues that they've had. And it's really hard to assess how well people do that if they provide a flawless showcase in the first try. So, I mean, again, messing up, quote unquote, the first time or the first few times isn't really a problem at all. That it's expected and is really also part of the showcase process, that we expect people to improve and to get used to our way of doing things during the showcase process.
Oh yes, and being able to actually take criticism is a big part of the whole showcasing process, I imagine. I have seen a couple of bad responses to pointing out flaws in someone's showcase before. I think it was years ago. I think Lady Nerevar was the reviewer, and this guy just completely cussed her out, and then it was like, okay, here's my new submission.
Yeah, we've thankfully been very lucky with the people who've been coming in lately, that just we have a pretty fantastic group of modders around. But yeah, definitely there are some cases where there are people who just can't take the criticism, unfortunately. And I mean, for the most part, we're quite accommodating, as we don't bite or anything. So it would of course be more understandable for people to react badly if we gave really harsh criticism, but we don't. And so, yeah, it can be an issue, but thankfully it hasn't been lately. And for the most part, again, we've really had great luck with the people who've been around, and it's quite a nice community at the moment.
Oh yes, it certainly seems like that from the Discord. And what's the most important thing for new modders to keep in mind when making claims on the project?
Yeah, so when taking claims, it is very important to, of course, keep the claim description in mind. And also, just if you have any questions, just ask about them. There are unfortunate times where the description isn't very clear, and so it's always good to ask if you're uncertain. But that's really, again, the main thing is just to basically just look at the information that's there, and if something is unclear, ask and we'll be happy to answer. And the other thing is that the one thing is the claims, and the other is, again, with the asset browser, where you can submit your own assets. And there as well, one of the very important things is to make sure that if you're submitting a model, that you make sure the model finishes uploading before you post the asset. Because if you post the asset too quickly, then the model doesn't get sent, which means we don't have it, and that's unfortunately happened a few times. But there as well, there are quite a lot of fields when you submit an asset or submit a bug report to fill out. But for the most part, they should be intuitive, and if they're not, again, you can always ask, or a lead or something can come along and can basically fill in the rest later. That basically just try and do as much as you can, ask if you have any questions, and then we'll see from there.
Oh yes, definitely good advice. And I always forget about the asset browser. I mean, it hasn't been there that long. It's been a couple of years. I just always forget that it's there.
Yeah, but it definitely has a lot of interesting things in it. It is quite a bit. We are basically trying to keep it clean every now and then, but at the moment it is quite full of content, and so. But there are a lot of ways to search it, and again, very interesting things over there, and it also seems to have been really helpful. Before we did used to require modelers to complete showcases and had standard model claims as before. But for modelers and for concept artists and so on, as in general, that approach seemed to often stifle creativity, or that they ended up not sticking around very much. And the asset browser is really a way to allow people to submit things of their own accord in a relatively straightforward fashion that we will then have and can then work with. So it's quite a nice addition.
Oh, that's good to hear. And moving on to our final set of questions here. Of new features, becoming available in OpenMW and also MWSC with new, Lua scripting functionality. Are there any plans for taking advantage of these new mechanics with Tamriel Rebuilt, perhaps as optional, add-ons?
The thing that I'm not a Quest developer myself, I'm pretty sure that quite a few of the Quest developers are interested in that direction. And in general, with open Morrowind functionality, while we definitely don't plan to move over to open Morrowind as a main platform anytime soon, and that of course creates clear limitations, but there is definitely a lot of stuff that we are excited about. And and so one of the things again is with open Morrowind itself, the performance improvement, but with the questing as well, as with the Lua scripting as well, it does seem very interesting. We are definitely keeping our eye on it, but no real concrete plans at the moment.
Oh yes, that's about what I expected. I imagine, you're probably waiting to see some further development in both of those fields before, really doing anything with them, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's also that, of course, with the Lua scripting, especially as it applies to Open Morrowind, there it's changed quite a bit recently as well, how the situation is, and so definitely something we're keeping an eye on, but again, it probably won't really have any impact on TR directly anytime soon, but it's definitely an interesting development, and it's exciting to see how that unfolds further.
Oh yes, and is there anything else that you'd like to talk about with Tamriel Rebuilt? Is there anything we've missed?
Nothing comes to mind, though I do actually want to get one thing out of the way, as I noticed that the one or two other times I did interviews, there have been a lot of questions about my accent. And so, while it was interesting to see the speculation in the comments, I thought I might as well clarify on that. I'm half Canadian, half German, and so my accent is an odd mixture. And so a lot of people seem to find it very odd, the accent, but should be understandable at any rate, what I'm saying.
Yeah, I hadn't even really noticed. It just sounds like a German accent to me, but I'm not really an expert.
No, I'd say with one of the videos I did before, there was a thread in the comment section with very interesting speculation. I think one person even thought that it may have been Japanese. A lot of the guesses were vaguely sort of Scandinavian and German, but there was a surprising amount of confusion about it, which rather amused me.
Oh yes, I can imagine. And of course, I have a typical Missourian accent that most people just can't recognize for some reason.
Yeah, it is interesting. And there's also, another thing that I'd add with TR is that it really has developers from quite a variety of areas. A lot from the Netherlands, actually, and other parts of Europe, but also, of course, from the US, from Australia and Turkey and so on. And so, yeah, but of course, for the most part, we used to actually have voice meetings, which did work out pretty well. But in the end, on Discord, using the text was just so much easier that we end up doing that. And of course, that also means that nobody has to be worried about their accent or anything. But for me, I think it's always quite nice and interesting just how multicultural or how international the Morrowind modders are. It's always very nice to see.
Oh yes, that's one of the nice things about the Morrowind modding community, is that it's at just the right size, that you sort of have forced integration of all these different nationalities, whereas before, back in the early days, everyone had their own separate community. The Polish modding community had their own separate Polish modding boards and everything. The German community had the same thing, and so on and so forth. But as our community has, sort of shrunk to this rather nice sort of size where everyone is, all together now, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's definitely also interesting in the context of TR that over the years there have been these weird shifts in demographics. That I think it started out as mostly a US project, but then there have been times where it's been where the majority have been Scandinavian members or the majority have been British members, and at the moment I'd say the majority are again from around the Netherlands, and so it's sort of interesting how that works out. But again, it's as I say, it is quite a nice size of community at the moment, and really a lot of interesting interaction going on.
Oh yes, and going into our last set of questions here, are there any mods outside of Tamriel Rebuilt in the community that you're looking forward to?
I have to make somewhat of a confession here that I don't actually play Morrowind that much in the end, because I spend most of the time developing. I really only open up the game to test TR stuff in it. But even so, actually, there are still things I'm excited about. What I've already mentioned before is Open Morrowind, and also the Project Tamriel, the other province mods. That there, it's always very interesting to see development, and also the Open Morrowind, the multiplayer, I'm quite interested in as well personally, especially in those sort of in the smaller context that I always like to play multiplayer games with my siblings and so on, and so that I always like. So definitely quite a lot of interesting development going on outside of TR, but for the most part I really am focused on modding in the end.
Oh, yes, I think that's true of like most of the modding community. It's like every time I ask this question, it's like, oh well, I didn't actually play the game, I just mod it.
Yeah, I know, and I'll say it's in a way unfortunate, because I will probably end up playing the more multiplayer at some point, for instance, but it's sort of like with a lot of people in their Steam libraries, that they're full of games that they never play. And for me at the moment, that's also a bit how it is with modding, that there are mods I'm interested in trying out, but I just never get around to it.
Ah, well, just become a video showcaser. That way you'll have an excuse to try them all out.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to go, but I think that might cut into the TR modding time a bit. Well, who knows?
So, yes, it definitely cuts into modding time. I haven't modded at all this year, so there's that.
Yeah, I mean, TR does have a Twitch channel where it does occasionally do streams, and I've occasionally been tempted to try it out every now and then, but I'm actually not really living by myself, and so, it's with the other people who are rooming with me, I don't really want to cause too much inconvenience there, but it is always an interesting thing to explore from the perspective of a mod developer to, do a bit of actual streaming and so on.
Alright, and finally, is there anyone in the community or on the Tamriel Rebuilt team that you'd like to give a shout out to?
Well, I mean, no shortage of people in the Tamriel Rebuilt team, of course. The other lead, for example, Atrionis, that he always does a lot of very good work for TR, and in general, the team there is just very good at the moment that we have. In the community in general, I mean, the modelers who have been helping with TR, I can't really call them TR modelers for the most part, because often they work with several projects and they have several things going, but their contributions are appreciated, not just to TR, but also it's always very interesting to see the things that they come up with in general. And I'd also like to make a shout out to the Project Tamriel team, which we're now working together with quite a bit. Again, the main things with Tamriel data, where we share assets, which will really, which you'll see a lot in Old Ebonheart itself, because it has a lot of Imperial content. That means that the Cyrodiil assets have been very useful to us there. And I'd also like to make a shout out to Greatness7, in fact, who has done things like implementation for Blender to allow with the newer Blender version models to be brought over to Morrowind and so on, which is all extremely helpful. So again, it's very nice to see how much is still going on in the TR, in the Morrowind modding community outside of TR, and it's always very good to see all the people contributing there.
Oh yes, Greatness7 really just helps out a lot, really all over the community, and I think he contributes more to other mods and projects than he actually makes himself. I mean, that's probably why his poison crafting mod just took so long.
Yeah, though that's also the case with a lot of the modelers, as I mentioned, that they often also have their own projects that they're working on, but still contribute a lot of things to other projects, and that is really helpful, because I mean, there's even been some, with Project Tamriel, there's even been some animation work and so on going on, and animators were really the hardest to find, because with Morrowind it's not a pleasant task to animate, and but to see that going on at the moment when Morrowind is such an old game, that it's really a good thing to see, and it also means that there might be some very nice things that, again, that in terms of assets, especially things that help Project Tamriel help us as well. And so, for example, with the new Khajiit forms that have been introduced, that we can use those in TR as well, and it's just really surprising as well to see so much still going on with such an old game in the modding community.
Oh yes, I mean, right now is a pretty exciting time. There is just a lot of stuff going on really everywhere. And of course, we had 110 mods submitted, or rather released, last month in May, which is the most mods that were released in a 1 month time period since like 2013 or something. So there's just been a massive spike in activity.
Yeah, no, it really is impressive, and it's also really just a case of the whole being more than the individual parts, that because people kept contributing to the Morrowind modding scene, that there's so much for other modders to work off of, and things like tutorials to get into modeling, and that you can also just ask other modelers and so on for tips, and it's just a really nice community to be in.
Oh yes, definitely. There's been a lot of community resources. Rubberman actually released a modeling tutorial, like a PDF. I think it was last month, which is pretty useful as well.
Yeah, actually, once the release is over, I'm rather interested in taking a look there myself and seeing if I can't, expand into another aspect of modding as well. But I've made a few attempts at modeling which haven't gone very well, and of course I have a lot of other stuff on my plate. But definitely, there's so many good tutorials at the moment that it's that I can't really fight the temptation to look into it again.
Oh yes, I mean, you're braver than me. I could never get into 3D modeling. I'm a quest martyr and a dungeon martyr at heart, and that's all I plan to do.
Yeah, I mean, another things that on sort of individual projects which I never released or anything, but I did do some quest work, and also with the current release I have been doing some dialogue work. But for me, actually, quest development, especially when it comes to Morrowind scripting, is also a bit of a thing that on the one hand I've dabbled a bit in, but also it's a whole other field that I'm rather intimidated to get into, and again I already have plenty of other stuff to work on, so it'll probably be a while before I do.
I mean, to me, questing and scripting, people are easily intimidated by it, but really it's pretty easy. I mean, it's tedious. That's the thing with Morrowind, is that quest design is perhaps maybe tedious, and scripting is a bit tedious, but it's easy on the whole, really.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm also really not so worried that once you do get into it again, there are a lot of very good people who are very familiar with scripting, both directly within TR and in the sort of connected communities and so on. So I'm not really too worried about being able to get into it, but it is definitely going to be a time investment to get into it, which I'm not really willing to invest in at the moment.
Oh yes, that's understandable. And, well, I guess that's all the questions I have for you, so thanks again for agreeing to do this interview.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure, and I would also like to say, of course, that people are always welcome in the Discord, and that I'm also always open for discussions there or on whatever platform as well. That's always a very enjoyable experience for me.
Oh yes, and for those listening, you'll find links to Tamriel Rebuilt's Discord server, their website, the Twitch stream apparently, and also their Nexus page down in the video description below. And also stay tuned next time for Rubberman, who will be in our next interview, the author behind the Tamriel Rebuilt project. So thanks for listening, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.